afternoon or good night and good day to everyone joining the conference organized by CG's Annual Conference 2022, Higher Education Knowledge for a Plural World. I welcome you all to join our special panel with a focus on talking about education and employment. The theme of today's panel is about more than employability, thinking about alternative views of higher education and the economy. So we are so honored to have a distinguished panel with us today. And this is Ho Mok. I'm from Lingnan University, Hong Kong, and also one part of the partnership of CG's Center at Oxford University. So I would like to introduce briefly about the panel today. We will have Professor Stephanie Allais from Leeds University, James Robson from Oxford University, Phil Brown from Cardiff University, and Nicola Ingram from Manchester Metropolitan University. So they will be talking about this important issue, especially against the context in the last 2-3 decades. Higher education expansion is on the rise, not only in global north, but also happening in global south. The question for us would be the supply of graduates from university or different higher education sector. Would there be enough jobs for them? And when we are producing more graduates and making them employable, but whether they are employed, these are the issues. But when we reflect upon education and employability, would there be any alternative, functions and views about higher education and also economy? So without further ado, I would like to invite Stephanie to start our discussion. So Stephanie, it's your floor.
Thank you so much. I'm going to actually pick up on where the previous panel, the subtitles are on again, where the previous panel left off. I'm drawing on a few pieces of research conducted at my research center, the Center for Researching Education and Labor at Wits University in Johannesburg, where we research post-school education in general, including higher education, vocational education, and workplace training. And I think that, we can really, there's a lot to be learned from poor contexts in which institutions are much weaker, as well as weaker sectors of the education system, such as vocational education, because often the problems are starker and therefore easier to see. They're sometimes more hidden in wealthier, more privileged contexts. The one thing that is really clear, particularly when you look at vocational education in Africa, is the preoccupation with employer engagement is much more intense, and so it reveals much more starkly the problems with the idea that employers want to and have time to engage with educational institutions, that they know what they need now in terms of the foundational knowledge and skills of their staff, and more importantly, that they will know what they want in the medium to long term. Another very clear problem is the damage that is being created by deinstitutionalization through the kind of new design principles like micro-credentials. And thirdly, we see the real triteness of a frantic stream of add-ons in vocational education programs with, employment readiness courses, social skills, CV writings, etc., which are stapled onto programs aimed at learners with weak educational backgrounds and mainly just have the effect of overcrowding the curriculum and making it harder to deliver any education and training at all. So this brings me to the kind of paradox of employability as a two-sided phenomenon. So because on the one hand, the employability debate assumes that education pays off in labor markets because employers are prepared to pay for knowledge, skills, and expertise that lead to increased productivity. So we all know this. Phil has written a book about why the idea of human capital theory might be dead. It was based on observations of labor markets in rich countries at a particular moment in time, mainly for men. But the paradox is that the angst about employability and the fact that we're debating it and universities are urged to pay attention to it is premised on the assumption that education needs to change in order to meet employer needs. It's doing the wrong thing. So it both could or should lead to improved productivity and therefore better wages, but also it's not. And it's not impossible for these two phenomena to coexist. It could be in principle the case that education used to fulfill this kind of role, but it's stopped doing so because of changes in the world of work. But that really does beg the question of what it was about the old education institutions that enabled educators to somehow produce what employers wanted without ever trying to or meaning to, while their contemporary counterparts apparently just can't do it, while actually trying really hard to in many cases. Another argument could be that employers are no longer willing and able to do training. And so employer education institutions simply have to take it on in the interest of their students and their economies, because it's something that young people need. But, you know, it's patently obvious, and this again is reflected in the curriculum debates, that education institutions are not the right places to learn skills that are learned in workplaces. So for me, what I see is employability as a symptom of the angst of massification, which kind of goes back to the Peter Scott's keynote about sagas and imaginaries. Massification of education at all levels has always led to angst about the curriculum. When numbers of people attending primary and secondary school education increased dramatically, reformers and taxpayers and education institutions were all intensely worried about what it was that these children would learn, and also who would pay for it. So this is just a reference to a paper with a colleague of mine, Yael Shalem, in which we kind of track over time the waves of hope and disappointment in educational expansion that you see across the globe in different contexts, with the idea that, you know, the hope that educational expansion will lead to social mobility and prosperity, and disappointment that on a large scale, actually, despite, you know, obvious individual exceptions, education has not been able to rupture inequality. So, you know, what we see in Africa today is acute angst about the secondary school curriculum. There's a recent report, for example, by the MasterCard Foundation, which focuses on reform of secondary school curricula in Africa. And it starts from this problem that primary school education, because of Education for All, has now been massified. So obviously the next step is secondary education, but it's not at all clear to the MasterCard Foundation what it is that these poor African children should be learning, given that there's very little labor market demand for skilled workers. Fewer than 10% of workers in the labor are in the labor force of most African countries are in what is regarded as formal work. And so they have a curriculum solution to this problem. This is their theory of change. You can read it in their report. But they basically conclude that reforming the curriculum along the lines of 21st century skills and technical employability skills will help young Africans to create their own work, and therefore will drive economic growth. So it's a very similar kind of phenomenon. The solution lies in the curriculum. And, you know, this debate obviously extends to university education in many African countries, because increasingly in many African countries, actually graduates are amongst the highest sector of unemployed people. They're much more likely to be unemployed in some countries than people with no education. This is the case in Ethiopia, for example. And obviously, of course, graduates from Ethiopia and many other African countries are seeking jobs outside the country in the global north. So the best performing students are leaving the country. And so that really brings me to my last point, which is the importance of analyzing national economies and their location in the global economy and global labor markets, and how this shapes the nature of education and training systems. So human capital theory, like the economics that it's embedded in, starts from methodological individualism. It constitutes the economic as markets, as a kind of a fetishized category in its own right, independent of social and historical context. But labor markets are segmented and structured both within and between countries. And we need to really start from that in understanding the factors which determine who get what jobs and under what conditions. If we look at education work relationships in the global south, the limits of human capital theory become clear really fast. So, and you know, the one point is the incredibly radical difference between elite and non-elite jobs and work in African countries, far greater than what you see in the developed world. So I just put up this slide, it's from South Africa. And what it shows what I want you to draw your attention to is this, there's a red bar, which is kind of the middle, and this little green bar, the 97th wealth percentile, is represented by someone who earns the equivalent of £2,000 a month if that person was a single parent with 2 children. If they were a single person with no dependents, they would probably be in the 99th wealth percentile in South Africa. So, you know, that it's just really to draw attention to the disparity, because credentials are shaped by the economy and the nature of labor markets, and labor markets with very limited rewards increase positional competition for credentials. And so, you know, this really just highlights the ridiculousness of positioning unemployment as a curriculum problem. And why locating the debates about employability in this context helps is because we need to, you know, it shows why this debate is not helpful when thinking about what should universities be doing and how can we strengthen universities in these contexts, which was also touched on in the previous panel. Just 2 very last quick points. The one is the importance of the idea of Samir Amin's notion of imperialist rent, which is his analysis of the radically different wages paid for the same labor in countries of the North and South, which has for many years enabled Northern capital to have sufficient profits to buy off its working class. And, you know, in a way, what we're seeing now, and the employability debate and casualization in the rich countries is a symptom of this, and I think Phil's earlier book, The Global Auction, also showed this, is the limits of this model. The model is really running up against its inherent structural limits. So, instead, I'm not arguing that we need to not locate debates about universities and their role in the economy. Rather, I'm arguing that we need to move away from a notion of economy as market transactions, as Peter Scott argued this morning, and away from labor markets as commodity markets, because they simply don't in any way function as commodity markets. Demand in the economy, it's uncertain how it will change. It might be that more skilled workers are needed. It might be that labor markets will casualize and fragment in rich countries and will remain fragmented and survivalist and informal in poor countries. But whatever happens, education has to maintain institutional and conceptual coherence as a set of societal structures for the development and acquisition and application of knowledge and learning dispositions. So rather, building education institutions and thinking about what they need is where our focus should be. And I've just put up a few references to the work that I've drawn on, as well as some research at our research center, which will be on the website for those who are interested.
Okay, thank you very much, Stephanie. You raised a number of very crucial issues for the panel discussion, and thank you for highlighting the paradox of employability and whether curriculum would be the solution. And you point out about the importance about whether making education for vocationalizing higher education and how would we come together repurposing about university education. Now, can I invite Professor James Robson? It's your floor.
Thanks, Kaho. And thanks, Stephanie. I completely agree with that analysis of the labour market and higher education. I don't have any slides. I'm just going to present a short paper here. So one of the biggest challenges facing HE at the moment is the extensive reach of the cold, dead hand of Gary Becker and the power human capital theory continues to exert over HE systems around the world. The reality is that human capital theory remains the dominant underpinning logic of almost all HE policy and the primary way in which the relationship between HE and the economy is framed. This relationship is founded on 2 key concepts, employability and productivity, which themselves are rooted in 2 assumptions. A linear relationship between investment in education and training and individual financial returns in the labour market, learning equals earning, the core premise of human capital theory, and a relatively simple linear relationship between increasing the level of skills in the population and increased productivity, ultimately resulting in economic growth. These individual goods, employability, and macro goods, productivity, are fundamentally entwined in much HE policy and provide mechanical explanatory power for each other. Skills, knowledge, and competencies derived from education and training provide individuals with both a positional advantage in the labour market and enhance their productivity. This drives organisational productivity, is reflected in and rewarded by enhanced earnings, and in a virtuous cycle drives macro level economic growth. The simplicity is alluring. However, the simplicity fails to capture the social, political, and economic complexities of the real world, the structures that shape labour market outcomes, and the profound inequalities that exist in educational and economic systems. Many people have provided detailed critiques of the relationship between HE and the economy, and Phil and his colleagues have very successfully argued that human capital theory is, or at least should be, dead. Therefore, I won't revisit the arguments other than to emphasize the fact that employability, as it is often framed in global HE policy, is always a relative good, relative to the institutions individuals attend, relative to the state of the labour market, relative to who individuals are and the networks and different kinds of capitals they bring to the jobs market. As Paul Ashwin has argued, I think most clearly, the current fixation on labour market outcomes, and I would argue particularly when reduced to purely financial returns, is a measure of societal inequality rather than a healthy economy or HE sector. But importantly, the current structure of the relationship between HE and the economy is rooted in a linear model of skills, supply, and demand. HE is positioned simply as a supplier of skilled workers for the labour market, responding to economic needs and the demands of employers. This is problematic because it shifts the cost of adequate human resourcing to individuals rather than employers, but is also problematic because employers are famously bad at predicting skills needs, particularly beyond immediate gaps and shortages and operational projections of a maximum of 2 to 5 years. This emphasizes inevitably a short-term approach to economic planning, forcing education and training systems to operate as a just-in-time supply model. And critically, short-term skills needs may be in tension with the longer-term needs of the economy. This is particularly clear in the need for the transformation of the economy to ensure a just transition to achieve net zero. Here, the short-term needs of employers are likely to focus on maintaining operational status quo or micro-innovations, rather than the long-term transformations required to achieve a sustainable economy. With HE positioned simply as a supplier to employer short-term demands, the sector is stripped of its potential to be a force for change, be that social, political, or economic, and renders it in a subservient dynamic with the labour market, scrambling to fulfill the short-term needs of employers. The end results are higher education and regulatory systems that overvalue employment, outcomes, and employability, and cram more and more transferable, decontextualized skills into already crowded, overcrowded curricula at the expense of meaningful, subject-specific knowledge that has the potential to transform students. But we can't avoid the fact that HE does have a relationship with the economy, and to deny it has an economic purpose does an injustice to the aspirations of millions of young people and their parents who view HE as a key pathway into work, and for many, social mobility. Similarly, it's clear there is a relationship between economic growth and HE, both in terms of the knowledge and skills graduates can bring to the labour market, and in terms of research, innovation, knowledge transfer, and spillover effects. Therefore, I think we urgently need a new conceptualization of the relationship between HE and the economy. I think Phil will argue for a very similar thing here, but rather than developing a new form of human capital theory, I believe we need to fundamentally reimagine the economic purposes of HE and be bold about the role that higher education can play in the economy. I'm going to try and do this in 2 minutes by making 2 key assertions about the economic purposes of HE. These are, firstly, that the economic purpose of HE should be to prepare people for purposeful work. Secondly, that the economic purpose of HE should be to prepare people for work in a way that changes the economy by driving employers to function in more meaningful, values-driven and purposeful ways to create a purposeful economy. So let me briefly unpack this. Firstly, I think we need to stop talking about employment and employability and talk about work, but break with economic orthodoxy in terms of how we use that word. So across classical, neoclassical and modern economics, humans are viewed as motivated solely by pleasure, utility or profit. And consequently, work is consistently positioned as a bad thing, something that people do only for extrinsic reasons. Only the allure of income motivates us to work. This notion is embedded in current HE policy, where graduates as Homo economici are seen as ultimately desiring lives without work, but having to work, demand appropriate financial compensation through contractual arrangements, employment, hence regulatory fixation on employment, financial returns and employability skills. But an alternative perspective is that what motivates humans is not the pursuit of pleasure, utility or profits, but the creation of worthwhile endeavors. It is not simply pleasure, but the pleasure one derives from a fulfilling existence and the contribution made to a larger endeavor that drives people. In other words, people are motivated by a sense of purpose and a need for purpose in work. This is a concept embedded this concept of work is embedded in Marx, Veblen, Arendt, and even Graeber, and is a perspective that has been repeated to me many times by students and graduates who emphasize that they want HE to support them to do something meaningful and purposeful. And this, I think, should underpin the economic purpose of HE, supporting students to develop agency, knowledge, and skills to demand and find purposeful work. And this quickly brings me on to the second point. There is an opportunity here to disrupt linear models of supply and demand and think critically about the kind of economy we want and should aspire to, and ultimately position HE as a mechanism of change. Rather than responding to short-term employer needs, the economic purpose of HE should be to empower students to become agents of economic change that demand the transformation of the economy needed to meet the challenges of net zero, digitalization, etc., by bringing key transformative knowledge and values into the labor market. This is a radical shift that positions individual students and graduates not as capital or indeed commodities, but as overt agents of economic change. As such, I think the idea of purpose should fundamentally underpin a reimagining of the economic role of HE through the lenses of individual agency and the concepts of purposeful work and a purposeful economy. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, James, for highlighting and critically engaging us to think about education and work and making about meaningful and purposive in work, and more importantly, driving us to think about, whether HE could train people to become agents of driver economic change. Thank you very much. Now, may I invite Professor Phil Brown, a very famous, author on the depth of, human capital theory. So Phil, is your floor.
Thanks very much. I had to sort of guess what other people were going to say in thinking about what to focus on. So I'm not really going to talk directly about human capital, but what I want to do is build on what Stephanie and James have just said. But I want to do it in terms of some work that we're now doing. We've got a major research program which runs across a number of countries, funded out of Singapore, which is really looking at that digital futures of work. So it really is about that reimagining aspect, because it seems to me that when we're talking about employability or a different kind of educational system, then underpinning it is this kind of view of where we're heading and a view of what kind of economy we can expect. And we've heard quite a lot about the fourth industrial revolution. And there seems no doubt that there has been this kind of confluence of technologies around AI, robotics, and blockchain, etc., which are seen to provide basically new areas of product, but also new areas of service, but crucially, new ways of doing existing things, which I think is also a very crucial aspect of these technologies. But rather than just let World Economic Forum and others define what the fourth industrial revolution might look like, we need to make this a contested concept, especially in its relationship to education and the labour market. And wherever we are, we're at a very early stage. But how we define it is therefore real in its consequences, especially in terms of policy and especially in terms, I would say, in terms of higher education. Because I can't see that we're in any kind of unique age of invention. It seems to me that what we're in is an age of recombination. We're seeing the unraveling of many of the assumptions and institutions of the past. We're seeing deliberate attempts to unbundle the nature of work, for example, to basically not focus so much on credentials, but focus on skill. And we're seeing also this recombination of both the human and the machine, new kinds of machines in terms of AI and the like. So how those things are brought together, what this looks like, is really matters to us. So industrial revolutions, whatever they are, they're always social. The technology is just a kind of a means. And in terms of one of those aspects of this is that institutional restructuring of that education work relationship. And it's that I obviously want to focus on, because the technology is not destiny. It's not, this isn't just a story about what is technologically possible. There are different ways of using those technologies. So how we think about them, how we work with companies, how we define our economic future, and how that is then interpreted in policy terms really matters. And that's an area which I'm particularly working on at the moment. And here I just want to make a distinction between labor scarcity and job scarcity. This is in the Death of Human Capital book, but I've been trying to extend some of these ideas more recently, because they have very different views ultimately of education and the notions of employability. The labor scarcity view is basically one we all are familiar with. It's the long-standing view that the more technologically advanced the economy becomes, the more there's a demand for high-skilled people, the more we see, therefore, a view of a race between education and technology, where education is being pulled along by the technological developments. And so in the last decades, we've seen a massive expansion of higher education based upon the idea of a knowledge economy, that because knowledge, it was assumed, is in the heads of the workforce, then we need more people with those skills. So we need to get more and more people into higher education. And now, of course, in the fourth industrial revolution, these people need to stay ahead of the robots. So they need to be smarter than the smartest kinds of robots. So the thinking then is about the nature of that education which can deliver that. Now, this is all consistent with orthodox human capital theory and the idea that people are investing or acquiring a bunch of valuable human capital, skills, attributes, experiences, which will have value in the labor market and which employers will value for a wage, and that will continue. However, we're also seeing an increasing concern about graduate underemployment and concerns that the graduates are not getting into the jobs that they were expected to get. Now, this is primarily then presented as a skills deficit or an education deficit problem, that the real issue, therefore, is how do we use, for example, new sources of big data, scraping, for example, hiring data from the web to get a better understanding of what the employers want. And then education should be reformed in order to deliver what those employers want. So it's a deficit model then, where employability becomes the primary purpose of education. And I'm sure this is very much in line with what Stephanie and James are saying. And it's something I think most people on this call would want to challenge. So what would an alternative job scarcity view look like? Well, the one thing it would say, it's certainly from my perspective, it's not the end of work. We're doing a lot of analysis on the nature of jobs, occupations, etc., and the likely impact of the technologies. We just simply don't see that end of work analysis. But what we really see, however, is there's simply not being enough of the jobs of the kind for which people are being trained for, and which they're expected to get, and which the policy promise of the opportunity bargain is being held out for those people. So we have, I would suggest, a fundamental capacity problem or a structural problem in the nature of the economy, the nature of work and the nature of the labour market, which means that we've got a more structural issue to kind of deal with here. That doesn't mean the supply side is unimportant. It doesn't mean that we don't need to reform education. We do in quite fundamental ways, but as has already been mentioned, not simply for the purposes of employability or jobs, because those jobs are not actually there in the way many people think. So we need to then reimagine what a different kind of view of education, of which work is a part and wage work is a part for individuals, what that really kind of looks like. So for me, the fundamental challenge is, how do we move the economy? So how do we work with businesses? How do we work with governments? How do we work with trade unions to see how we can move the economy in ways which are enhancing for labour, they're sustainable in terms of the environment, and they're also productive. So I think that issue of machine-centered as opposed to human-centered future work is really, really important. And to just give you a very quick sense of this, we're working with notions of the cognitive challenge, because if you look at the business literature and technological literature, there's lots of discussions about robotic process automation, which is the automation of routine jobs. But what we're also seeing are processes of cognitive process automation. And this isn't just the direct substitution of, say, robots for teachers or robots for lawyers or whatever it might be. This is the ways in which new technologies are used to capture working knowledge, knowledge work, which is seen to be in people's heads, and converting it into working knowledge. Now, we've talked about this previously in terms of digital Taylorism, but it seems to me that the processes of platformization that we're now seeing is a crucial part of that. And we're studying the nature of platforms at the moment to better understand that, because we're seeing that re-stratification of professional, managerial, technical jobs. And what we're seeing fundamentally is this gravitational pull in a downward direction in terms of graduate labor. And we're seeing this in a whole number of different kind of countries. Now, back almost scarily, back 2 decades ago, wrote the book on the mismanagement of talent, which in a sense was all about the potential failure of the knowledge economy. Much of what we said in there holds true today, but one of the distinctions we wanted to make was, in terms of that duality, was between what it takes to do the job, so the kind of the skills, the attributes of that, but also what it takes to get the job in terms of how individuals stand relative to each other in a positional competition. And it seems to me that there's the post the pandemic, you know, there's some interesting things going in the labour market, but it doesn't really hide the fact that we're seeing intensive positional competition and social congestion around education and labour markets. We see from the pandemic just the scale of educational inequalities in both dimensions, in terms of getting access to the education and the qualifications to get jobs, but also in terms of getting access to positions in the labour market. And one of the things on the horizon, of course, is the developments around digital labour markets and the presentation of a digital self within those, and what the implications of that are likely to be. So when we're talking about labour scarcity, job scarcity, we're talking about contested futures of education work. And therefore, the question which leads, I think, to James's point, whose needs of industry are we talking about? I mean, I think this is particularly important, because we're seeing how that race to higher education in the past is now being re-evaluated across the political spectrum, actually, with increasing emphasis upon applied forms of education rather than so-called academic education. But none of that really deals with the kind of the status issues, parity of STEAM, and also fundamental differences in income potential from that. So ultimately then, what we got to ask is, what does it mean to be human? So what would an educational system look like in a context where that relationship between the human and artificial cognition is getting, in many ways, a lot more kind of interesting? And you can see two models. In fact, what you'll see is likely a stratification where some people have access to permission to think, others don't. So we can have a model where we're dumbing down people so they can work with the technologies, or we can develop new forms of collective intelligence, which we would obviously support. And in the book, the Death of Human Capital here, we outline what an alternative view of human capital might look like, which we hope will be of interest to people. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil, for presenting a very interesting story for us. But more importantly, you propose to have a rethinking about work and also education HE. We're working with the company for finding what they need and in what way we can change our higher action provision. Okay, last but not the least, now we would like to invite Nicola, Ingram, and it's not your floor. Nicola.
Sorry, I'm just being
No problem. Take your time.
technically inept. Am I sharing my screen?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Ugh.
You got it.
Okay, there it is.
Okay.
Is that happening? Yeah, I really much prefer real life conversations. Let's see, slideshow, here we go. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me. And it's just been so interesting today so far, listening to everybody. There's just such a wealth of thinking to digest, and it's really good to be part of this conversation. What I'm going to do is talk, and I'm going to try and talk quickly about 4 different things. So I'm going to have 4 main points. One thing I want to talk about are metrics and how metrics work to construct graduate success in very narrow terms. And then I want to talk about then the impact of that and if we're thinking about graduate success in very narrow terms, in terms of employment success and what that means, then what are the problems? Let's think about the returns to higher education and some of the complexities of that. And then I want to talk about the broken links, so the broken links between education and employment and the meaning of that. And finally end with cruel optimism, but also on a more optimistic note by drawing upon Peter's work earlier about how we might sort of reconfigure and rethink the saga of higher education. So my perspective is really, my springboard is really a UK springboard, but hopefully it will have resonance for a kind of global thinking about higher education and the link between education and work. In many higher education systems globally, graduate success is constructed narrowly in terms of economic outcomes. And within the UK, this is particularly acute because it's enshrined in higher education policy. And universities are held to account in the UK. They're measured, they're labelled according to the Teaching Excellence and Student Outcomes framework. And this framework uses, among many other measures, it uses employment measures and employment data through the Graduate Outcomes Survey to ascribe quality ratings to universities. And so universities are regarded as being successful or not successful quite simply on how their graduates fare in the workplace. And we all know that this is problematic for many reasons, not least of all because there are other ways of valuing higher education. But if we look at graduate outcomes within the UK, we see that 69% of graduates in the UK in 2018-2019 were in high skilled jobs. Those graduates within the UK system are regarded as the graduates who matter, the graduates who have value, the graduates who bring value to the higher education system, the graduates that ensure that higher education institutions are regarded as having value. But if that's 69%, that means that 31% of students, 31% of graduates are not in work that is highly regarded, are not in work that has value, and are not regarded as making a significant contribution to the value of an institution. And in some ways are constructed as failures, and failures of the system and failures of institutions. So from this kind of thinking, there has emerged in the UK, and the logic of this thinking kind of would direct us towards thinking about degrees as having low value. So there's an emergence, or it's been around for a while, this notion that some degrees have value and some degrees don't, and ideas around value for money come in here as well. So in 2019, for example, this headline that I have on the screen, the Secretary for State, the Secretary for Education, Damien Hines, was calling for an end to low value degrees. So, it really calls into question this idea of what is a low value degree. And we're thinking of in the UK, this is constructed obviously in terms of degrees that don't lead to work that pays, or work that is regarded as high skilled. And I think this is interesting in terms of points that were made earlier about meaningful work, because I think that that's where the shifts need to go. And I agree with what James said earlier. But that's the direction of travel in the UK, and that's progressed even further. We now have a situation where the government are moving towards punishment for institutions that fall short of getting 60% of students or 60% of graduates into work that is regarded as highly skilled. So there are lots of problems with this. One of the problems relating to this is that not all institutions are going to be able to get 60% of their graduates into work. So this is an obvious attack on certain types of institutions. It's an obvious attack on students from non-traditional backgrounds, because of course their chances of getting work is very much conditioned by where they've come from, and as well as anything else. And it's an attack on certain subjects, because there is an obvious link between some subjects and work, and there are obvious difficulties for other subjects in getting students into work. And then there are differences and problems relating to different regions. And if we look on the left-hand side of my screen, I've just taken this from an OFS report. And if we look across this sort of shows us different earnings for graduates according to regions. And the highest earning regions are the ones with the greatest number, or the greatest proportion of dark blue. And the lowest earning regions for graduates are the areas that are mostly dark red. And you see this great disparity across regions. So universities in different regions will have different outcomes that are not to do with the quality of their education. They're more to do with labour markets within those local economies. And so there are lots of problems around, around thinking about constructing graduate success very narrowly in terms of these economic outcomes. And then this sort of leads to thinking about the diminishing class returns to higher education. And so if even to set aside some of the main critiques that we could have around focusing on economic returns and focusing on economic outcomes in terms of valuing and measuring education, if we set that to the side and think narrowly about the economic returns and the problems within that, a key problem of using graduate employment outcomes based largely on earnings and job status to measure the value of HE is that it doesn't take account of the complex changes in the labour market. So on the one hand, we have in the UK and globally an increase in the number of people participating in higher education. But then we have, you know, as Phil Brown has famously for 2 decades at least said, you know, there's this congestion in the labour market. And I've used this chart on the right-hand side from Goldthorpe because I think it really visually for me, it illustrates quite nicely the changing shape in the labour market. And we see what we basically see here is that while the sections of the labour market have contracted around working class jobs, so low skilled labour has contracted, and at the same time jobs in the professional services, in the professions and managerial classes have expanded over successive decades. But that rate of growth of expansion has slowed down, and you know we're putting more graduates into the market, and it's more and more congested, and there are fewer jobs for them to go into. And in terms of class, if we're thinking about social class, I think this creates interesting areas for thought. And Goldthorpe, he shows that the link between origins and destination has largely remained the same over successive decades. So that's interesting for social mobility, that we don't see these major shifts in social mobility, even with more and more working class young people going to university and gaining educational higher level qualifications. So social class of origin is less likely to determine educational attainment than in previous decades, but the link between class of origin and class of destination remains intact. And I think this creates interesting conundrums for thinking about higher education and thinking about the labour market, and of course thinking about the purposes of higher education. So I've been thinking of this in terms of broken links and the broken link between education and employment. And I'm thinking then about what does that mean? What do we need to do to reconceptualize higher education? And also to start thinking about ways in which we might think about these broken links, rather than thinking about skills and furnishing young people with additional skills. We might want to try to challenge the inequalities that are actually underpinning these broken links. So Goldthorpe argues that any equalisation in educational attainment that may have been obtained in relation to class origins is being offset by a decline in the class returns that education brings. And a report by the Social Mobility Commission, an analysis of the labour force survey, shows that 60% of people from a professional or managerial background are employed in professional managerial jobs, whereas only 34% of people from working class backgrounds are employed in the professional or managerial occupational group. So again, it's this persistence of the reproduction of inequality. So higher education is not the social mobility panacea that popular discourse believes it to be. So what can higher education be? And despite an increased understanding amongst young people about the congested nature of the graduate labour market, they continue to invest in higher education. I think we're seeing some really interesting shifts generationally in beliefs around the higher education and beliefs around what higher education can do for young people. And I think that we're moving towards a greater understanding for young people that higher education isn't going to deliver employment. Higher education isn't necessarily going to deliver social mobility. But at the same time, along with that shift, young people are still investing in higher education. And I think that that's an interesting area for further explanation. I think there are unanswered questions about generational expectations of higher education and the perceived value of a degree. I think we often assume that young people go to university for social mobility, or they go to university to maintain their social status, or they go to university for a job. And of course, you know, James and others have highlighted that we cannot deny the importance of university for delivering those sorts of outcomes. But at the same time, it's useful to consider the reframing, and to go back to what Peter said about the other ways of thinking about the purpose of higher education, other ways of like changing the narrative really about the value of higher education. And I think that those shifts are starting to happen. I think Generation Z have seen the struggles of millennial graduates. They see them in the labour market, not necessarily realizing their dreams, the promises that they had, that university was going to deliver these outcomes. And that's creating interesting spaces for thinking differently. And thinking beyond employability. I think there's this movement, I don't know if you're aware of it, there's on TikTok and social media, there's been this kind of explosion of people attaching themselves to this idea of I don't dream of labour. So this idea that it's almost like the death of the dream job discourse. So young people are not buying into this idea that there is a dream job, that there is such a thing as a dream job, and that there are things beyond labour to value in life. And I think that is something that it's an interesting turn, and it will be interesting to see how those things develop. And I want to end by talking about cruel optimism. So I've been completing a book on graduate employment transitions, and the participants of that study are of the millennial generation. And unlike previous generations, they are really seeing we're seeing real struggles in the graduate labour market for both working class and middle class students. And it's leading to this idea that there is a cruel optimism inbuilt within the higher education system, that they have been promised they've been promised good jobs, they've been promised better lives, and that's not being realised. And I just want to I'll just read out this quotation from Berlant so you can think about what cruel optimism means. Cruel optimism names a relation of attachment to compromised conditions of possibility. What is cruel about these attachments, and not merely inconvenient or tragic, is that the subjects who have X in their lives might not well endure the loss of their object or scene of desire, even though its presence threatens their well-being, because whatever the content of the attachment, the continuity of the form of it provides something of the continuity of the subject's sense of what it means to keep on living and to look forward to being in the world. And I think the challenge for higher education is to create conditions that are not compromised conditions of possibility, to create conditions for young people to flourish, where cruel optimism isn't the kind of thing that is their reality. And to be thinking about the system, we need to redirect the system towards equity so that the conditions of possibility are no longer compromised. And I'm going to again go back to Peter, because I was really taken with his talk today, and this notion of reframing the saga and having a new saga for higher education. I think that's really, really important for the future and for Generation Z and future generations. And
thank you very much, Nicola. I think thanks for panelists for offering very rich material for us to digest. And now the floor is open. I see a lot of questions in the chat room already. So Sumata, could you unmute yourself and ask a question? Sumata? So the question he raised is, what will be the future of education policy in Southeast Asian countries after post-pandemic period? Any panelists want to attempt that one? Yeah, Sumata, please unmute yourself. So it's another question from Olga. Olga, can you unmute yourself and ask?
Yes, thank you for the presentations. My question was quite perhaps naive, but It was to James and all speakers. So if you want to challenge the narrative of the role of higher education, how can we also challenge it either with or without challenging how the existing system is designed? So right, if students are paying for higher education, how can we expect them then not to expect some sort of economic return? So yeah, this was my question. How do we redesign the existing system so it also matches our future oriented research sort of aspirations?
Thank you for the question. Anyone want to respond? James, please.
I'm happy to have a quick go at that. Yeah, Olga, I completely agree with this point, and the way that you phrased it in the chat is in terms of commercialization as well. And look, I completely agree that the dominance of the employability discourse and the reductive emphasis on labour market returns and financial returns goes hand in hand with the neoliberalisation of the sector, marketisation, commercialisation and commodification. And so discussing critically all of those things along with the associated issues of rankings and so on and so forth is absolutely essential. It's part of the same debate, I think. But importantly, I don't think we can sort of go back to some sort of false golden age before commercialization and think about this in terms of some sort of educational purity. I think as you probably highlighted more clearly in the way that you phrased the comment, we need to look to the future. We need to work with where we are and look forward, and engage with those debates in terms of what the sector needs and should be. And for me, that's systems thinking. That's how we sort of begin to engage with the needs of individuals and the needs of the economy, and the educational purposes as well as the economic purposes of education and training more broadly. And that's to embed policy in systems-based thinking and tertiary-based thinking to celebrate the diversity of the different parts of a tertiary system.
Okay, thank you, James. And Diana, you have a question for Phil. Diana, please.
Oh, thank you. Yes, well, thank you all for some really thought-provoking presentations there. But this one is for Philip, and reflecting on what new technology is doing to the workplace, and the development of new technologies to do work is being progressed at a pace by a very small elite and very highly skilled group in ways that remain utterly mysterious to most of us. It's very hard to engage with, thinking about what they're actually doing and what this means for us. But AI always depends for its value to all of us on the people actually creating it and on their own human ingenuity and their sense of value to the population. But where do we come into that conversation? Is there some way, do you think, of opening up and democratizing that process so that we can all be part of that debate? It's going to affect us hugely, but it's very hard for us to engage with it. We don't know what's going on.
Yeah, I think it's an absolutely crucial issue. And it's very difficult to really think about how best to do this. I mean, we've had a lot of discussion about ethics and AI, which is important, but there isn't really a public discourse where there's an understanding of where those technologies are moving. Now, what's quite interesting is a lot of people who work in companies also don't know that either.
Yeah, that's true.
And I think that's part of the problem for us, is getting a real sense of where these technologies are moving and what the possibilities are. But crucially, it's not just about the technological possibilities, it's about how then do we use those technologies. And one of the things we're arguing about with companies as well, because I think that's important to actually engage in that conversation, is to say, look, if you work with a model of like a war for talent, so where you put your focus on the top 20%, these are the people you see as adding value. How will you use those technologies? Well, you'll use them to actually enhance the command and control of that 20%. If you have a broader view of the contribution of your workforce, then you're likely to use the technologies in different ways. Now, where are the companies doing that? Where are the consultancy companies that are presenting a different way of looking at those technologies and how they're likely to work? So that for me is pretty fundamental to this agenda, and that's what we're trying to work on. But you're absolutely right. How we then broaden that out into a public discussion, as well as an educational discussion about this, is important. And I would say, just in terms of that last point, is that I mean, most universities are bought into the knowledge economy. They've been perfectly willing to take the cash, and now it's being sort of turned against them. But I think that there's a need for an honest discussion within the universities themselves and the higher education institutions about what their real purpose is, and to have that, and to make sure that's an honest discussion. Anyway, that's my point.
Okay, Samantha.
Yes,
please.
Yes. First of all, good afternoon, all of the guests. I am from India. My question is that whenever we are talking about education, it first comes for population, because population is a major challenge in Southeast Asia. Whenever we are talking about population-based education, we need some kind of skill development function. Nowadays, MSME sectors and micro and small scale industries need to be raised up, and skill development is the only way to intervene the population crisis and promote education as per their living. Because in colonial legacy, whenever I am not intervened in history, but the colonial rulers are only set up the education system due to their profit, just for a mass building education system. But it is not right now is going on in the right track, because we are in new era. Now is society 5 and industrial revolution 4 is going to be happen. We are technology based and our population is rises. Now India, China, there are many more countries are overpopulated. So there are need some certain changes in education. When education is remove the job scarcity and promote employability. That's all. Thank you.
So thank you very much for your comment. Any colleagues want to respond? If not, I can see another chat in the chat room. Is Anna Chan still with us? There's a question here. Any agreeing?
Yeah,
please.
Thank you.
Yeah, please unmute yourself. Yeah. Okay, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Anne, and I'm a doctoral student in Institute of Education in UCL. And so I think Philip and James kind of give some explanation of my question. So which is about the different aims of university. So I'm wondering, how can university balance the academic aim and practical aim of their education? And also, we know the duality of employability. So sometimes employability is relative to the social changing situation and other stakeholders. So obviously, universities, they're not the only stakeholder in promoting employability. So I'm wondering, like, to what extent should university develop employability education? Like, what exactly would they do to foster such kind of education? Thank you.
James, do you want to answer?
James, you are named to answer. Are you happy to answer?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to.
Okay.
It's my name. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge challenge, isn't it? Yeah, as I said in my bit, we've got finite curricula with only so much space and lots of different agendas to deal with, and I think that the biggest problem from a university perspective is trying to negotiate what students want and what policymakers demand that they do, essentially, in response to sort of top-down pressure to meet what's perceived as economic needs. And I think the power of regulation actually skews the dynamic. So personally, I think that universities should be doing quite a lot to empower students to gain, as I said, purposeful work, to have a good labour market outcome that they want, that the students individually want, but that the dynamic is skewed because of regulation, because of flawed regulation. And so we need a readjustment to get the balance right in terms of higher education. But if we actually take a much broader systems view and think about tertiary systems as a whole and talk about higher education, further education, or technical and vocational education, then those different purposes are much more balanced. And so some courses will be much more geared towards vocational goals, labour market outcomes. And so the balance should take place probably at a course level and taking into account sort of the complementarity of systems that work together, rather than what we have in too many national systems where they work in competition with each other.
Yeah, thank you for the response from James. I think thank you for the panelists for coming along with a very great presentation by engaging in very productive dialogue. But talking about the relationship about high HE and economy offering alternative views, I think university education is not only producing graduates for the labor market alone. We have to be mindful about how to think about universities, the role of university in producing citizenship, promoting public good, and also enhancing social justice. And also at the end, most important of all to us is enhancing youth well-being. So these are the very important issues, but running only 1 hour, we cannot solve and also resolve all the issues being highlighted. So thank you very much for joining this section. We will now break for lunch and return at 1:50 p.m. UK time. After lunch, we will be splitting into parallel sessions. Thank you, colleagues, and may I put our hands together for the panelists. Thank you. Bye-bye. See you.
Thanks, Guy.
Cheers,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Thanks.
See you later.
Thank you.